Good morning and welcome to Church at Home with Rachel for Wednesday, the 15th of December. I can't believe how quickly this year has gone. It has, considering everything that's been going on, it's gone very quickly. As we get closer to Christmas, especially during COVID and wondering about restrictions and how we probably should enforce more rather than relax them right now, I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about people and decision making and who has the right to make decisions for their own lives. Back before I left Halifax in 2019, there had been a lot of work done in the diocese around the M.A.I.D, the decision, the ability for people to make a decision about their own death, about medical assistance in death, and people choosing to end their lives when they wanted to, as opposed to suicide, simply going off by yourself, making a decision and doing harm to your body, actually making that decision, an informed decision with doctors when you perceived that your life and your life, quality of life would no longer be where it needed to be because of illness or physical, mental, things like that. And it was quite polarizing, the conversations. We had the beginnings of work toward a hospice, and palliative care was available, but not necessarily readily available. If you lived in town, in the city, then you had more access to palliative care beds and palliative care hospice style places. But if you were out in the country or on the coast or in the more rural areas in Nova Scotia, then palliative care in its best sense wasn't really necessarily a great option or an available option. Part of palliative care isn't simply that you are able to have the drugs that you need to keep you comfortable until your body just shuts down and dies, but also the ability for your family members to come and be with you. When I was in Stratford in my first parish, there was work had been done, sort of cutting edge work and research done on palliative care. And the hospital in Stratford had a palliative care ward. And we as clergy were trained in understanding how different it was. So the number of, now of course there was no pandemic then, but well, SARS happened, but that's something else. There were no restrictions on family, the number of family that could visit, or the visiting hours that, you could only come between, 2 and 5 and 7 and 9 at night, things like that. They would make an effort to make sure there were comfortable chairs or a cot in the room with the patient who was palliative, and a television and a radio or things like that. They've had showers for family members and a little kitchen, the staff kitchen that family members were allowed to use to be able to go in and spend, have some breakfast or make themselves a meal when they were staying with their loved one. And it was absolutely incredible, the work that they did. And that included the work they did for young mothers whose babies maybe didn't make it. Because they had the palliative care ward, they also then had nurses who were trained in end-of-life issues. And it was really incredible. But what happens when palliative care is not available, is appropriate palliative care? I'm not just talking about, a doctor being willing to provide morphine or something to keep the pain away until the person dies of their illness. But I'm talking about the ability to keep the person alive comfortably, but also have people come to visit them and a pleasant room to be in. One of the gifts of the ward or the wing for the palliative care in Stratford was that the rooms were not those dreadful pastels of the 1950s and 60s that hospitals often have on their concrete blocks, cinder blocks. The rooms were beautiful, and there were paintings and there were, comforters for the beds and things like that. So you didn't feel like you were in a hospital, not as much anyway. But what happens if that is not available for someone? Because palliative care, as much as we would like to suggest that maybe that it should be what is available for people always, it may not be appropriate. If this is if we're talking about a disease that's going to take years to end a person's life, or isn't necessarily the disease itself, isn't necessarily something that will end life, but is detrimental and eliminates a good quality of life for a person, then we get into the conversation about at what point does a person have the right to make the decision about what they are willing to go through and what they're willing to put up with their mind and their body and society in the meantime. And that's a tough thing to think about, especially at Christmas. But I think especially at Christmas is when some people are thinking about these things, because watching your loved one go through hell, suffering through treatments that are not going to save their lives, but prolong it, and maybe even prolong it in a painful way. That is so hard to do. Being the person who knows that you are prolonging this pain for someone else. If you could just die now, then they wouldn't have that pain, that difficult journey to walk through. Yes, they will have the pain of knowing that you're gone, but not the pain of watching you slowly die. Such a very, very difficult thing to think on, and difficult decisions to make. I'm not suggesting that we support M.A.I.D, or that we necessarily, beef up palliative care. Although, really, I think that palliative care is something that we need to, in our hospitals and in our nursing homes and our residential homes, and even in our own homes, find ways to increase the ability to provide appropriate palliative care to those who need it. I think that's really important. But what about those end-of-life decisions? I was having a really good conversation with someone just a while back who has had a preliminary diagnosis of cancer, and who has watched her peers die, and her family members are gone, and she has other family members, of course, who love her and are watching her and want to be with her, but she's made the decision not to pursue treatments. That her doctors will help her to face what's coming ahead and to recognize what's happening, but they're not going to be any extraordinary measures. There's not going to be any chemotherapy or radiation or things that would make her sick in an effort to get her better when she's already in the end years of her life, and she's ready and she's prepared mentally and spiritually to say those goodbyes. And now she's doing that with her family, to be able to say to children and grandchildren, we've had a good run. I love you, and now it's time to go gently into that night, not to fight it. But in that conversation, I realized that I was struggling with her decision. It's not my struggle to have. Hearing someone else say, you know what, I'm ready to go to be with Jesus. I'm ready to be with my husband and my parents and my sisters and brothers. I'm ready to take on whatever this new life will be in Jesus Christ. I'm prepared for that. I've lived a good life, and now I'm ready to live a better one. So the question becomes, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with people who are making decisions about taking their own life? How do we deal with the ramifications in our lives of those who have already taken their lives, for instance, through suicide, or those who are considering their decision through M.A.I.D, medical assistance in death, or those who are looking at palliative care? How do we, who are watching the loved ones, the ones who stand back and honor the decisions of others, how do we reconcile that? How do we feel about that? And I think, although it seems a heavy and depressing topic, Christmas is one of those times when we really need to face that, especially during this pandemic, when so many people are not able to be with their families, and maybe some of these decisions are coming out of that solitude, the forced solitude that we've had. That doesn't mean they're bad decisions. It does mean that we have to be willing to listen, and to put ourselves in there, to have empathy, to pay attention to what they're saying and understand why they're saying it. If someone is ready to be with God, and their body is saying, I'm ready to quit, Do we force them? Do we guilt them? Do we encourage them to go through treatments that will make life even more difficult for them? Or do we come alongside them and live a palliative life, keeping them comfortable, sharing stories, remembering, honoring who they have been as they honor who they are now, and preparing for who they will become in eternity with God? I don't have any answers. I have my own hunches, I have my own opinions about these things, but I think these are things we cannot skip over. I think they are things that we need to pay attention to, whether it's palliative care, whether it's M.A.I.D, whether it's suicide, whether it's simply natural causes that take someone we love, or us. I think we need to give those things thought. And at this time of preparing for Christmas, a time when we recognize that God came to be with us, Emmanuel, God with us, so that we could be with him at the end of life, in Easter, in our glorious resurrection. Maybe we shouldn't be scared of or running away from these decisions. Maybe we should be facing them head on. I don't know. What do you think? Have a thoughtful day. God bless you. And I'll see you again tomorrow for Church at Home with Rachel.